A day in the life of a 17-year-old factory worker in 1943. The morning shift. The alarm clock's shrill ring pierced through the darkness at 4:30 a.m., and Dorothy Dot Williams slapped her hand down on the button with practiced efficiency. In the bed across their small room, her younger sister Margaret groaned and pulled the thin blanket over her head. Dot sat up, her feet finding the cold floor of their third-floor walk-up apartment in Detroit's East Side. At 17, she'd been working at the Willow Run bomber plant for 8 months now, and the pre-dawn wake-up still felt unnatural. She dressed quickly in the darkness, pulling on her sturdy dungarees and a worn flannel shirt that had once belonged to her older brother Jack, who was somewhere in the Pacific with the Marines. The last letter they'd received had been postmarked 3 weeks ago, and her mother kept it folded in her apron pocket. Reading it so many times, the creases were beginning to tear. Dot tried not to think about it as she wrapped her dark brown hair in a bandana. Factory regulations required it, after too many girls had gotten their hair caught in machinery in the early days of war production. The apartment was silent, except for her father's snoring from the front room where he slept on the couch. He worked the night shift at the Chrysler tank plant and had only gotten home an hour ago. Her mother would be up soon to make breakfast before heading to her job at the neighborhood grocery store, stretching their ration books and employee discount to keep the family fed. Dot grabbed the lunch pail she'd packed the night before, a sandwich made with the last of the week's meat ration, an apple, and a thermos of weak coffee sweetened with a precious teaspoon of sugar. She tiptoed down the creaking stairs and out into the March darkness, where the street lamps cast yellow pools of light on the empty sidewalks. The commute. The streetcar stop was already crowded with other early morning workers, mostly women and older men. The young men who should have been there were carrying rifles in places with names Dot could barely pronounce: Guadalcanal, North Africa, the Aleutian Islands. The war had transformed her city, her neighborhood, her entire life. A year ago, she'd been a junior at Southeastern High School, worrying about pop quizzes and whether Tommy Morrison would ask her to the spring dance. Then came December 7th, 1941, and everything changed. By the following September, with Jack enlisted and money tight, Dot had left school to take a job at Willow Run. Her principal had tried to talk her out of it, but her mother had signed the work permit with shaking hands, and that was that. The streetcar was packed, bodies pressed together in the overheated space that smelled of machine oil, cigarette smoke, and cheap perfume. Dot found a handhold near Mrs. Kowalski, who worked in the riveting section. The older woman's hands were wrapped in bandages. The rivet guns took a toll. Cold. "This morning," Mrs. Kowalski said, her Polish accent still thick despite 20 years in America. "Sure is. Heard it might snow later. In March. This war, it makes even the weather crazy." Mrs. Kowalski laughed, but her eyes were tired. She had 3 sons in uniform. The streetcar rattled through the dark streets, stopping frequently to pick up more workers. Through the window, Dot could see the city preparing for another day of war production. Detroit had become the arsenal of democracy, and the factories never truly slept. Willow Run itself ran 3 shifts around the clock, producing B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate that would have seemed impossible just 2 years ago. Arriving at Willow Run. The plant appeared in the distance as the streetcar approached, a massive complex of buildings that seemed to stretch forever. Willow Run was the largest room under one roof in the world, over 3.5 million square feet. And Dot still got lost sometimes in the maze of assembly lines and workstations. Ford had built it in record time on farmland in Ypsilanti, and now over 42,000 people worked there, about 40% of them women. Dot filed off the streetcar with hundreds of others, a river of humanity flowing toward the plant gates. Security had tightened considerably since she'd started. Everyone had to show their identification badge, and there were armed guards everywhere. Sabotage was a constant fear, though Dot had never seen anything suspicious. Mostly she saw tired people working hard, trying to do their part. She punched her time card at exactly 5:58 a.m. Being late meant a dock in pay, and her family needed every cent. Her weekly wage of $37.50 was more than her father made before the war, though with rationing and inflation, it didn't go as far as it should have. Still, it was better than the $12 a week she might have made as a shop girl or secretary, and the work felt important. The work Dot's station was in the wing assembly section, where she worked as a bucker on a riveting team with Rose O'Connell. Rose was 23, married to a sailor, and had been at Willow Run since the plant opened. She taught Dot everything about the job in those first terrifying weeks when every task seemed impossible. The work was physically demanding and tedious. Dot's job was to hold a heavy bucking bar against the back of a rivet, while Rose used a rivet gun on the other side, squeezing the rivet tight to join sheets of aluminum together. They had to work in perfect synchronization, sometimes in cramped spaces, often in uncomfortable positions. By the end of a shift, Dot's arms ached and her ears rang despite the cotton wool she stuffed in them to muffle the noise. The morning shift began with their supervisor, Mr. Henderson, checking their station and reviewing the production quotas. They were expected to complete hundreds of rivets per hour, everyone meeting strict quality standards. Inspectors came through regularly, and any defective work had to be drilled out and redone. "Morning, ladies," Mr. Henderson said, clipboard in hand. He was maybe 50, with grey hair and a pronounced limp from the last war. He was fair but demanding, aware that lives depended on the quality of their work. Corporates pushing for increased production. Roosevelt himself said we need more planes, and we're going to deliver them. Let's make today count. Rose caught Dot's eye and rolled her own. They'd heard this speech before, but they both understood the underlying truth. Somewhere over Europe or the Pacific, men their age were depending on these planes. Jack might be called on to storm an island with air support from a B-24 they'd built. It made the monotonous work feel urgent. They fell into their rhythm, the rivet gun's rapid-fire percussion creating a symphony with dozens of other teams working on other sections of the wing. Dot positioned the bucking bar, felt the concussion through the metal as Rose squeezed the trigger, moved to the next rivet. Again, again, again. Her world narrowed to aluminum and rivets and the burning in her shoulders. Break time. The morning break came at 8:30 a.m., 15 precious minutes to use the restroom, eat a snack, and rest their arms. The break room was crowded and noisy, filled with women in work clothes and bandanas, looking nothing like the magazine illustrations that showed factory girls with perfect makeup and neat hair. Dot found a spot at a table with Rose and a few other women from their section. Betty, Alice, and a new girl named Helen, who'd started just 2 weeks ago. Helen was only 16, lying about her age to get hired, and she still had the shell-shocked look of someone overwhelmed by the factory environment. "How you holding up, honey?" Betty asked Helen, pulling out a cigarette. Betty was in her 30s, her husband working at Ford's River Rouge plant, her 2 kids staying with her mother during her shifts. "My arms feel like jelly," Helen admitted. "And the noise. Does it always sound like that?" "You get used to it," Alice said, though she had to raise her voice to be heard over the general din. "Been here a year, and I barely notice any more." "My husband says I talk too loud now," Rose added with a grin. "Says living with me is like living at the plant." They all laughed, and Dot bit into her apple, savoring the crisp sweetness. The break room bulletin board was covered with posters. "Loose lip sink ships. Buy war bonds. We can do it." The famous image of Rosie the Riveter flexing her arm had become ubiquitous, though Dot thought the real riveters looked a lot more tired and a lot less glamorous. "Anyone hear the news?" Betty asked, lowering her voice slightly. "My husband says the Allies are planning something big. Won't say what, but something big in Europe." "My brother's in Italy," Alice said quietly. "Last letter said it was hell." The moment of levity passed, replaced by the constant underlying anxiety they all carried. Every woman in that break room had someone in uniform: brothers, husbands, fathers, boyfriends, cousins. The war wasn't an abstract concept, it was personal. "We better keep cranking out these planes then," Rose said firmly. "Best thing we can do is make sure they have the equipment they need." The whistle blew, signaling the end of break. 15 minutes had felt like 5. They filed back to their stations, ready for another 3.5 hours of rivets. The afternoon by noon, when the lunch break arrived, Dot's hands were cramping, and she had a headache from the noise and the poor ventilation. The plant was kept cold to prevent the workers from overheating in the summer, but in March it was just uncomfortable. She ate her sandwich quickly, the bread slightly stale, the mystery meat probably mostly filler, but it was food, and she was grateful. In the cafeteria, she sat with Rose and listened to the radio broadcast that played over the loudspeakers. The news was carefully curated, victories emphasized, setbacks minimized, but they all read between the lines. The war was going better than it had been, but it was far from over. Casualty lists were still long. Gold stars still appeared in windows throughout the neighborhood. A recruiter had set up a table near the cafeteria entrance, signing up women for the military auxiliary services. Dot paused to look at the poster, showing a smart-looking woman in a WAC uniform, but she couldn't imagine leaving her family. And besides, they needed her paycheck. "Thinking about enlisting?" Rose asked, noticing her gaze. "No, Mama would have a fit. Plus, Jack said in his last letter that he wants me to stay in school, get my diploma. He doesn't understand I had to leave." "Boys never understand. My Tommy thinks I'm just helping out until he gets home, like I'll go back to keeping house and having babies." Rose's voice was complex, affection mixed with frustration. "But I like this work. I like the money. I like knowing I'm doing something that matters." Dot nodded. She understood completely. Despite the exhaustion and the noise and the danger, there was something empowering about the work. She was building bombers, real bombers that would fly in real combat. At 17, she was contributing to the war effort in a tangible way, and that meant something. The afternoon shift. The afternoon was harder than the morning. Fatigue set in, mistakes happened more easily, and the supervisors prowled more frequently. Dot watched an inspector reject an entire section that a team had completed, forcing them to drill out dozens of rivets and start over. The women's faces showed their exhaustion and frustration, but they got back to work without complaint. Around 2 p.m. an accident occurred 2 stations down. A woman named Marie lost her grip on a bucking bar, and it fell, crushing her foot. The scream was audible even over the machinery, and work stopped in their section as supervisors rushed over. Marie was carried away on a stretcher, crying, and Dot heard later that several bones were broken. "That's the 3rd accident this week," Rose muttered. "They're pushing too hard. People are tired, working too fast." But the push for production continued. Dot's supervisor came by within minutes, urging everyone back to work. Time was literally of the essence. Every hour of production lost was a plane not built, ammunition not made, supplies not shipped. Dot's arms trembled as she held the bucking bar for yet another rivet. She'd lost count of how many they'd done, the number blurring into meaninglessness. Her entire existence had narrowed to this one repetitive action, performed hundreds of times, thousands of times over the months she'd worked here. The women of Willow Run. During a brief pause while Rose changed out a drill bit, Dot looked around at the other women working in the vast space. They were young and old, black and white, daughters and mothers and wives. Some wore wedding rings on chains around their necks, afraid of catching them on machinery. Others had photos tucked into their pockets, images of servicemen in uniform smiling for the camera. Near the end of the wing assembly line, Dot could see a team of African-American women who'd been hired as part of the recent push to expand the workforce. They faced segregation in the plant cafeterias and restrooms, often got assigned the worst jobs, and were paid less despite doing the same work. Dot had tried to smile and be friendly, but the social divisions were rigid and uncomfortable. Her friend Mary Washington worked in the paint section, and she told Dot about the discrimination she faced. White workers who refused to work alongside her, supervisors who were quicker to criticize. Yet Mary showed up every day, did excellent work, and took pride in her contribution. "My brothers are fighting for this country," she'd said. "Least I can do is build the planes they're flying in." The complexity of the situation troubled Dot. The war was supposedly about freedom and democracy, yet here at home, those principles seemed inconsistently applied. She didn't have answers, just a growing awareness that the world was more complicated than she'd learned in school. The final hours. By 4 p.m., the end of the shift felt simultaneously near and impossibly far away. Dot's supervisor made another round, checking their work, noting their progress on his clipboard. They were meeting quota, which was good. Bonuses were sometimes given for exceeding production goals, and Dot was saving for a new winter coat. Her current one was 3 years old and had been patched twice. Rose started singing while she worked, an old Irish folk song her grandmother had taught her. Despite the noise, Dot could hear her voice, and soon others joined in. Music helped pass the time, made the work feel less mechanical. The supervisors tolerated it as long as production didn't suffer. At 4:45, Rose suddenly stopped working and grabbed Dot's arm. "Look," she said, pointing toward the window. Through the high factory windows, visible in the late afternoon light, was a completed B-24 Liberator being towed out for testing. The massive aircraft, silver and imposing, represented countless hours of work by thousands of people. Dot had worked on many wings that had eventually become part of such planes, but seeing the finished product always gave her chills. "Think about it," Rose said softly. "That plane might carry bombs over Germany, might help end this war, and we built it." Dot nodded, unable to speak around the sudden lump in her throat. The enormity of it, the connection between her tired arms and the global conflict, was overwhelming. The whistle. At exactly 6 p.m., the shift change whistle blew. The sound was both relief and reprieve. Dot and Rose secured their tools, cleaned their station, and joined the mass exodus toward the time clocks. Dot's time card showed she'd worked exactly 12 hours, 10 regular hours and 2 overtime. The overtime pay would help. The evening shift workers were already filing in, looking fresh, while Dot and her co-workers looked exhausted. She recognized some of them, neighbors, former classmates who'd also left school for war work, women who'd previously been homemakers and were now breadwinners. The walk to the streetcar stop was slower than the morning arrival. Her feet hurt, her back ached, and she could feel the bone-deep fatigue that came from sustained physical labor. Around her, thousands of other workers made the same trek, all heading home to a few hours of rest before starting again tomorrow. The evening commute. The streetcar was just as packed going home, filled with tired workers slumped in seats or standing in the aisles. Dot found a seat next to an older woman who immediately fell asleep on her shoulder. She didn't mind. They were all in this together. Through the window, she watched Detroit pass by. The city looked different than it had before the war. Busier, more purposeful, but also more strained. There were closed signs in shop windows where Japanese or German-owned businesses had been forced to shut down. Air raid wardens walked the streets, checking that blackout curtains were properly installed. Rationing had changed storefronts with handwritten signs announcing "No sugar today" or "limited butter." The streetcar passed a neighborhood park where Dot had played as a child. It was now a victory garden, divided into small plots where residents grew vegetables to supplement rationed food supplies. Her mother tended a plot there every evening after work, coaxing tomatoes and beans from the soil. Homecoming Dot climbed the 3 flights to their apartment at 7:15 p.m., each step an effort. The smell of cooking, potatoes and some kind of meat stretcher casserole, greeted her as she opened the door. Her mother was at the stove, still wearing her grocery store apron, her face tired but determined. "Good day?" her mother asked. "Same as always. Made." "Quota. Saw a finished bomber roll out." Her mother nodded, understanding. Margaret was at the kitchen table doing homework, and their father was awake, reading the newspaper in his undershirt, his shift at Chrysler not starting until 10 p.m. "Dot!" Margaret jumped up. "Miss Henderson stopped by school today. She said if you want to do evening classes, you could finish your diploma. She's organizing a program for war workers." Dot felt a surge of emotion, hope mixed with exhaustion. Finishing school had seemed impossible, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe she could do both. "We'll see," she said, not wanting to commit to more exhaustion, but unable to completely dismiss the possibility. Dinner was quiet, the radio playing softly in the background with war news and updates. They'd rationed their meat stamps carefully this week, and her mother had managed a small pork chop for each of them, supplemented with potatoes and canned green beans from last summer's victory garden. As they ate, the news broadcast reported on bombing raids over Germany. Dot wondered if any of the planes had been built at Willow Run, if any of them carried wings she'd helped rivet. The connection felt both profound and surreal. Evening after dinner, Dot helped Margaret with her math homework, struggling to remember concepts she'd learned just 2 years ago, but which now seemed to belong to a different lifetime. At 8 o'clock, her father left for his shift, lunch pail in hand, moving with the same weary determination Dot felt in her own body. "Be safe," her mother called after him, the same words she said every night. Dot took a quick bath in the clawfoot tub, the hot water limited by rationing, but still blissful on her aching muscles. She washed the machine oil from her hands and arms, though some stains seemed permanent now, worked into the creases of her skin. In the bedroom she shared with Margaret, Dot laid out her work clothes for the morning and packed her lunch pail. The routine had become automatic. Preparation for the next day began immediately after the last shift ended. Margaret was already in bed, reading a magazine by lamplight. "Dot," she asked quietly, "do you think Jack's okay?" The question hung in the air. It was late April, 3 months since his last letter. "I think he's fine," Dot said, trying to sound confident. "Mail's probably just slow. You know how it is. Betty Morrison's brother was killed last month, in Tunisia." Dot remembered Betty from school. They'd been in the same English class. She didn't know what to say, so she just squeezed Margaret's hand. "We're doing important work," Dot finally said. "Building those planes. Everyone we build might protect someone like Jack. That's what I tell myself when I'm too tired to think." Margaret nodded, satisfied enough with the answer to return to her magazine. Dot lay back on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. The days all blurred together now. Wake up, work, come home, sleep, repeat. But it mattered. In a world turned upside down by war, her work mattered. Reflection. As sleep approached, Dot thought about the strange transformation of her life. A year and a half ago, she'd been a child, worrying about school dances and movie stars. Now she was a factory worker, contributing to the war effort, helping support her family, navigating a world of adult responsibilities. She missed the simplicity of high school, the freedom of youth, the luxury of worrying about trivial things. But she also felt a sense of purpose she'd never had before. She was part of something larger than herself, something that mattered beyond her small corner of Detroit. The women at Willow Run had proven something. They could do men's work, could handle complex technical tasks, could be productive and competent in roles society had always said were beyond them. Dot had heard the men's doubts when the factory first hired women. They'd be too weak, too emotional, too distracted. But they'd proven those doubts wrong, day after exhausting day. What would happen when the war ended? Would they all go back to being secretaries and homemakers? Would the lessons learned about women's capabilities be forgotten? Dot didn't know, but she suspected that something fundamental had changed, that the women of her generation had crossed a threshold they could never fully step back from. The letter. Just as Dot was drifting off to sleep, she heard her mother's voice from the front room, a sharp gasp, then crying. Dot's eyes snapped open, adrenaline flooding her system. She rushed out to find her mother clutching a letter, tears streaming down her face. For one terrible moment, Dot thought it was a telegram, the kind that began, "We regret to inform you." But her mother was smiling through her tears. "It's from Jack," she sobbed. "He's alive. He's in Australia, recovering from malaria, but he's alive." The relief was physical, a weight lifting from Dot's chest. Margaret had come out of the bedroom, and the three of them held each other, crying and laughing. Jack was alive. For today, that was enough. "He says the food is terrible, but the nurses are pretty," her mother read, laughing and crying simultaneously. "He wants to know if we're keeping up with the Tigers' spring training." "Does he ask about me?" Margaret wanted to know. "Of course, honey. He says to tell his favorite little sister to keep up her grades and not give Mama any trouble. I'm his only sister. That makes you his favorite by default." They stayed up for another hour, reading and rereading the letter, extracting every possible bit of information and reassurance from the carefully censored words. By the time Dot returned to bed, it was past midnight, and her 4:30 a.m. alarm would come brutally early. But she didn't care. Jack was alive. Tomorrow she'd go back to Willow Run and rivet more wings for more bombers, and she'd do it with renewed purpose. Somewhere in the Pacific, her brother was fighting. The least she could do was build the best damn planes possible. Another day begins. When the alarm rang a few hours later, Dot woke with the same aching muscles and bone-deep exhaustion, but also with something else, a renewed sense of connection to the larger war effort. She dressed in the darkness, packed her lunch pail, and headed out into the pre-dawn streets of Detroit. The streetcar was filled with the same tired workers, the factory loomed in the same way, the time clock punched with the same mechanical click. But Dot approached her station with fresh determination. Rose noticed immediately. "You look different today. Good news?" "Letter from my brother. He's okay." Rose smiled, genuinely happy. "That's wonderful. Really wonderful." They took their positions, Rose with her rivet gun, Dot with her bucking bar. The whistle blew, and the machines roared to life. Dot positioned the bar against the aluminum, felt the familiar concussion as Rose squeezed the trigger, moved to the next rivet. Again. 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 She was 17 years old. She was a factory worker. She was a daughter and sister and citizen. She was tired and strong and scared and proud. She was part of the generation building the weapons that would win the war, and decades later, she would tell her grandchildren about this time, about the women of Willow Run, about the day she learned that she was capable of more than she'd ever imagined. But for now, in this moment in 1943, she was just Dot Williams, holding a bucking bar steady, helping build another bomber, doing her part in a war that touched every corner of her life and would define her generation forever. The work continued, the war continued, and so did she. Epilogue. By the end of World War II, Willow Run had produced 8,785 B-24 Liberator bombers. At peak production in 1944, the plant completed one aircraft every 63 minutes. The women who worked there, like the fictional Dot, but representing thousands of real women, would largely be pushed out of these jobs when servicemen returned home. But their contribution to the war effort and their demonstration of capability would influence the women's rights movements of subsequent decades.